Good afternoon and welcome to the New Albany Methodist Church. I'm going to start with an introduction of myself. It's good to see so many of our viewers. And we have a lot of enthusiasm, and that's good to see. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to those of you that are watching online. We appreciate that, and we know that some of you will be able to pick this up later online. If you turn the light back on a little bit, I would introduce myself to get started. Thank you. I am Leanne Githens. I'm a volunteer at the Wilson County Historical Society. I want to introduce Joyce Garner. She is the president of the Wilson County Historical Society Board, and it's a group effort. We have had a number of people contributing to this presentation. I want to recognize Glenn Acton and his wife Brenda, who's not in the room just yet, Bud Anderson and Peggy Anderson, Mara Cook, Dan Millar. Over the years, there have been others that have contributed to what the knowledge that the Historical Society has. Linda Snyder has contributed information, heavy information. A really good source that we've heavily relied on is the research that was done by Leila Tyndall. And there are several documents that she produced. One of them is a booklet on Dr. McCrae. And if you have this booklet, I'd encourage you to read it. It's really fascinating reading about New Albany at the turn of the century. But this is one source. Her book that she did, People of the South Winds, has a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you. And much of that information came from the newspapers of the time. So she has gone back to the original source. The primary source documents are what we call them. And so we feel like that's accurate information. Now, I would tell you, too, that people's memories are an interesting thing because your family stories play a part in what you remember, what you think you remember, or what people actually do remember. And sometimes that is a little bit at odds with what might have appeared in the newspaper. So as I present information today, keep in mind that I am telling you what I know, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to let me know what I've missed, what stories I've gotten maybe a little bit wrong or incomplete. There may be stories about New Albany that should have been included that were not included. So just kind of bear all that in mind. A lot of what I'm telling you happened 100 years ago. So I'm hoping that if the stories present someone in less than glorious light, that we'll take that into consideration. But we'll start with some pictures that have come from various sources, and when I'm done with my presentation, then we'll have an opportunity to go back and look at some more again for a little bit longer period of time, or make some corrections if I have those wrong. So now you can turn the lights off. Okay, we will begin with Mooney Mill, Ghost Towns of Wilson County, New Albany. And I want to clarify that and explain to you where that term ghost term comes from. Ghost towns, according to the museum industry, ghost towns are those towns where there used to be a post office and no longer is. It does not mean that there's not a vibrant community there, or that there are no people there, or that the buildings are all decaying. That's not what it means. It simply refers to the lack of a post office where there used to be one. So technically, that is the case for New Albany. It's always helpful for me to kind of put things in context. I try to figure out when New Albany got started in relation to other events that happened. So that's why this is up here. In 1861, Kansas became a state. 3 years later, Wilson County was organized. A year after that, the Civil War ended. Now, keep in mind that when the Civil War ended, then people started moving. I mean, the migration started before the war ended, but that was a major part of people wanting to be settled and moving west. It would be wrong to assume that when the white people moved in, that there was nobody here. We must acknowledge that there were many Native Americans in this area, and that brought the white people moving in brought about some conflict, as you can imagine. In September 29, 1865, the Canville Treaty was signed by Osage Chief Little Bear. And so then land could be sold to anyone beginning in 1867. This photo is of Little Bear Chief Little Bear as he's known. So all white people living on those lands prior to that needed to pay rent of some sort to the Osage Indians. How much of that actually occurred, I don't know. 3 years later, after that treaty was signed, Fredonia was organized, and then New Albany organized in 1871. This is the first plat map of Wilson County that I'm aware of. It is Fall River Township map. You see Fall River right there. There's New Albany. This is 18 to 81, and New Albany is on the map. There's Fredonia, Altoona, Neodesha, Guilford, so places we know about. This is from the 1881 plat map, and specifically of New Albany. We see here a structure of note. We see one there. The depot. This is 1881 again. So now this is 30 years later, the township map. There's New Albany, Fredonia, Altoona, Neodesha. You see there's a little bit more activity, but New Albany is still in the same place, of course. The township maps get very detailed about who owned the property. So here's New Albany proper, here's the river, here's the railroad, and we'll zoom in a little bit closer. First thing I would point out is that seems to be some discrepancy in what is on this plat map and what was actually correct. We believe that this section here was actually larger and went farther south. So I don't know if the problem is with who made the map or if it just happened at a later date. That I don't know. But I wanted to acknowledge that this may not be an actual correct. I want to point out to you a couple of names that are well known to you. Robert Mooney, there's Johnson, Hall, Whiteside, McCrae, and Blinn. This is Mooney, William Hall, Mary Jackson. Think about that, a woman owning property, she being on the deed in 1910. Also from the 1910 map, and again we see that this is probably not as inclusive as it should be. Here we see a couple of more buildings that are noted. There's the church, not the structure that we're in, but the location. No, it's that one, I'm sorry. That's the school right there. So this is where we are. There's the bank. There's a church, Baptist church, and there's that row of structures there. Right there it says lumber yard, which encompassed a number of blocks. So who are the founding fathers? Please come on in, and we have some handouts, and we'll give you a moment to find a place to sit where you can see. There are certainly enough chairs, and we welcome everybody that is joining us online or that is here in person. So people of note,
While there were white settlers in the area who traded with the Indians as early as 1863, the two families commonly known as the, quote, founding fathers were William Hall and family, who settled here in July of 1865, and Robert Mooney and family, who also came in 1865. The Hall and Mooney store was located at 2nd and Main. Here we see William Hall and his home. And I think we have someone in the room that lives in that house. Still here, thank you, Mara. And Robert Mooney and his home. And some of you may know this as the Tyndall property. Looks a little different as I understand, but the structure is still there. So how did the town get its name? Well, the government actually started April 20, 1871. Mary Richards Hall was the wife of William Hall, and she named the town after New Albany, Indiana, where she was from, or may have been from. This picture that I'm showing you here is a building, a music hall in New Albany. So it gives you a bit of idea that New Albany, Indiana, where she came from, may have been a place that was thriving, maybe had more culture, and perhaps Mary Richards Hall was longing for home. Post office. So William Hall became the first postmaster in 1866. The post office location actually has been moved at least 5 times. There was a rural route that came out of the post office here, employing a rural carrier and a city carrier at one time. The picture on the right is Lydia Letterman in front of that post office, and that was taken in 1965. This picture on the left was taken, I believe, in 1966, but you can see it's the same building. This woman is Clemmy Markle, and it was taken in 1945. She was one of the postmistresses. William Hall's youngest granddaughter, Isabel Cook, was the second to last postmaster. And I'm sure there are many in the room that still have fond memories of Isabel. Harvey at Piquel was postmaster when the tornado damaged the building in 2009, and then the post office was closed. And those of you that have had any connection with the postal business know that it can sometimes be a hard fight to maintain a post office in a small community, and the loss happens gradually when you lose your rural route, and then when there's a disaster, the postal system will go for the low-hanging fruit and say, we're not going to invest again, and you're done. So we all know that has a major impact on communities, but that was the reality. So New Albany, industry and natural resources. Why did people settle in this area? What drew them to this area? And we know from advertising, flyers that were published in newspapers, and we know that how this was advertised, and it was advertised as there were verdant pastures for fattening Texas cattle, the river, and of course it was a fabulously beautiful location. The Fall River did power sawmill, flour mill. 1866, Jackson, Hickox, and Fay Mill. It was a grist mill, sawmill. It flourished for 15 years. In 1870, Wanzer, Chase and Company. It was a corn and wheat grist mill, and it became Mooney Mill after 1 year. And then it looks like that lasted for about 30 years, discontinued in 1912. Of course, the discovery of natural gas in the county in 1903 had a major impact on the whole county and the whole region, because it would power brick mills, glass plants, all sorts of industry that took place. And of course, this was a rich gas field and oil field here in the New Albany area. This is a charcoal sketch by Emma Thomas of Mooney Mill. It's kind of interesting to me to compare this drawing to this photograph, and if you look at the trees and you look at the, you know, it's definitely the same picture, the same structure. And it looks like maybe she did that at the Centennial in 1965. Okay, the brick plant. The brick plant has been a topic of some conversation because we know that it was established in 1905 as the Empire Brick and Gas Company. Some records that you will read say that it was never in production. They did receive orders, but it was never in production. I think we have evidence that definitely proves that that was not the case, because we know that the bank, the state bank, was, the bank here in New Albany was made of those bricks. But it didn't last long. 1909, August 9, the plant sold at a sheriff's sale. It was purchased by Louis Wirth, T.L. Certain, and Samuel Blinn for $7,000. So another draw for New Albany becoming a place to be is the proximity to the railroad. So we know that the impact that railroads have on communities, both when they come and when they go, because their impact is not just for commerce, for moving product in and out of town, but it's for moving people in and out of town. So 1879, the Frisco Railroad came to New Albany. And I think this is a fabulous quote. I love this. A quote from the Times said, "The settlers who were here prior to the building of the railroad were the real pioneers." They had to really be self-sufficient, plan ahead, those kinds of things. There was a stockyard loading grain and later cattle out of the depot. There was a section house. There were 4 daily passenger trains running from Wichita to Joplin that came through New Albany. So I've read an account where people, and the account said women, but which it may have been largely, but that they could get on the train here, go to Wichita, do their shopping, and come back and be in New Albany by 5:30 or 6 o'clock. And my first thought was, now, that's pretty cool. This is really amazing to have access to a larger community to do some shopping. And then my second thought was, what was the impact on the local grocer, the local department store? Okay? And how different is that when we choose to buy our groceries at Walmart as opposed to the local store, choose to shop out of town as opposed to shopping local? So it's just another example of a story that's been around a long time and impacts many, many communities. It's not just New Albany or Fredonia. Here's a great photo of the depot. The photo is undated, but the fact that there's a horse and wagon, that tells you a little bit of the time period. On the left, we see the section house, and you see the rail car, that little car in front of it. This one on the right is the depot, and it was reportedly painted a deep dyed crimson. All right, the government. New Albany had the first petticoat government. In 1935, the town voted 4-1 for the only 100% petticoat city government in the world. Women that were elected: Susie Murphy, Catherine Bivens, Mary Blinn, Lily Morgan, Effie Laughlin, and Laura Shelton. This was a huge story nationwide. They were widely interviewed. KNBC, the Associated Press, the United Press picked it up. They received a letter from the Queen of England. This photograph here was published in the Los Angeles Times. I just think that's pretty incredible. And I do want to share with you a quote that I think it comes from Susie Murphy at the time. She stated that the ladies had run on the Independent Party ticket, and their platform was, quote, "honesty, progress, and liberty." And quote, "We promise to remember our platform even after we have been installed into office. There was no feminist issue in our campaign. Neither will we establish an effeminate administration." Susie went on to say, quote, "We have resources galore, oil wells by the hundreds and unlimited gas supplies at our city gates. We have an agricultural resource that never fails. Our city is situated in the beautiful Fall River Valley, which is second only to the Nile in fertility. Never have we had a complete crop failure." Susie's final words were, quote, "It seems that while we have been rocking the cradle, the men have been rocking the nation. And since the men have made such a mess of things from Washington, D.C. down to the smallest municipality, why not give us women a chance?" Something to be said for that. So here's another picture of the petticoat government. In the accounts of their election, I found it kind of interesting that after each name they would note that the woman was married and how many children she had. And I'm guessing that if those were men that had been elected, they would have been reported, that would have been reported a little bit differently. So I'll leave my editorial comments right there. But I will say that, so they were elected in, I believe, April, and one of their first acts was to approve the street lights here on May 14, 1935. So these women got things done. We know that there are many, many businesses that used to exist in this town. And this list here, they were not all in existence at the same time. You see, there was a newspaper here for, it looks like about 10 years. It was called the New Albany X-Ray, and then later the Kansas X-Ray. Trading Post, Flour Mill, Sawmill, Rovenstein Mercantile Store, a hay barn, which bought local and shipped out on the Frisco. A couple of drugstores, actually, not just the Hogue drugstore. 2 livery stables, 2 hotels, barbershop, and barber Mr. Alfred Morris. And I think that structure is still in existence. Telephone office, of course, that wouldn't have been in the early days. Lumber yard, and I think there might have been 2. I don't know if they were, it's doubtful they were in existence at the same time, but I know there was one Cooley, and then there was one Certain or Certain. Can somebody correct me on the pronunciation on that? Okay, we're going with Certain then. Brickyard, 2 blacksmith shops, a garage, 5 filling stations, a couple of grocery stores, a cream station that may have been in connection with a grocery store, cafe, photography shop, beauty shop, custom leather shop. So there was a lot going on, and very, very vibrant community. I want to share a narrative that was written by Mrs. Fred Pratt, Beulah. Well, it was written by Beulah Petty, but I think it is. Yeah, it is by her, and it really tells a lot of the specifics. And yeah, let's take a trip down memory lane with her. "I was married in 1927 and was surprised what a general store contained after being used to shopping in Fredonia stores. On the left, after you entered Pratt's general store, were ready-made clothes for women, children, etc. Winter coats still hung on hangers since it was March. As I remember, he carried some shoes, especially overshoes, rubber boots for the entire family. I suppose this area also had shirts and overalls for men, too. On the right side, down through the front area, were the groceries. The young daughters of the Morgan family were hired to help clerk, as each grew old enough. This served 2 purposes. They were paid a small wage, and also some of their wages went to help pay on the family's charge account. We know that in many small communities, being able to charge at a grocery store or some kind of a store was really crucial, waiting on the harvest to come in or bills to come in, and it was common practice. Fred Pratt was known to carry many people on a charge system. Farmers, when they sold a crop or a few head of stock, came in to either pay the account or make a payment. He was known to accept grain or hay at times. Then he would either resell to someone who needed grain or hay, quite often losing on the deal. In the back of the store was a section that contained hardware, perhaps horse collar pads that were put on a draft horse, first to protect their necks, then the collar. Horses were widely used for farming in those days. A pair of hames would be hung above the collars, and all came in different sizes, since horses, like people, come in all sizes. Pratt's store was on the corner, just a block east of Dr. McCrae's residence. Next to the store was John Petty's blacksmith shop, where he shoed horses, sharpened plowshares, etc. Work was always piled up over a week, laying on the floors, but he would always tell a customer, "Oh yes, I can do it tomorrow." Next to the blacksmith on the south was the lumber yard, doing a thriving business run by Mr. and Mrs. Elmer Foraker. They not only dealt in lumber, but bought coal by the carload, left on the railroad tracks to be unloaded in so many hours or demurrage would have to be paid. So 2 or 3 men would vie for the jobs, as they were paid not by the hour, but for the number of tons of coal each unloaded. Most of it was kept at the lumber yard, but a few customers waiting on coal would have it delivered into their coal cellars direct. And some were hard places to get a team and wagon backed into the proper position to unload. I'm kind of curious of any of you who live in this community and maybe an older home, if you still have what would be known as a coal dump. Okay, I see at least one hand. So you can identify something on the building where the coal would have been dumped into the basement. The Historical Museum in Fredonia does have that kind of a window and a spot in the basement that we know that was used for. Corn and wheat were shipped out in freight cars with the same arrangement, only in reverse, as the railroad cars had to be unloaded in these cases. Some men able to shovel grain or coal with either hand came out with the biggest daily wage. The stockyards were built close to the railroad where cattle were held until they had enough to fill a stock car, and these were usually shipped to Kansas City to be sold. A few were sent to the Chicago markets in case Missouri's prices were beneath what the extra freight rates would cost. John Petty not only ran the blacksmith shop, but owned a small farm as well, hiring a hand by the month to do the milking. Myrtle, his wife, raised turkeys and chickens and had a garden to help feed the family and the hired hand. Their daughter, Helen, had married previously in 1927 to Norman Cooley of Coyville. There were more than one cream stations, usually connected at first along with a filling station. One of the first was a filling station run by Alex Thomas, and his wife tested the cream and bought eggs. Cream, when it accumulated to fill a 5-gallon can, was taken in large cream cans to the freight depot to be shipped to some dairy making butter. I believe Lee McBride was in charge of the freight depot, connected with the depot proper, where you went to buy a ticket for the passenger trains. West of 3rd and Rock Street, where the Pratt and other businesses were, was 2nd and Rock Street running north and south. Dr. McCrae's home was on the north end, then Hoag's Drug Store on the same side of the street. Miss Jenny operated that in the 1927s, her father having died. On the east side was Al Morris's barber shop. Next to it was Herbert Payton's grocery and post office combined. Charlie Brown, who had sold out his ranch southwest of New Albany, ran the grocery store there in the 1930s, after Payton's death. I remember when a large sack of candy was given to the youngsters of the family when they came in and paid up their bills. Our family was one. So, in addition to the many stores that were here in town, we should acknowledge the agriculture in the area. These two photos come come from Dan Millar, and they are certainly representative of what farming, what agriculture was like at that period of time. Not every farmer would own a threshing machine. They would come together to use one that was maybe owned by several people or that may have traveled into the area. And I just noted in this picture, I want to point it out. Whoops. Let's try the other one. The cook shack right there that no doubt traveled.
Leanne, I'm not sure exactly where that was at right around New Albany. It could have been over here on McCrae. It could have been over here by Cooks. I mean, I don't really
Yeah,
know.
it was in the area
Yeah,
outside of town.
but it is somewhere right here close. Both of
Yes.
them.
Okay, then Wiley Johnston's store. This was very early, and I believe that it was across from the bank in the location that was later Laughlin's store. It was here in the 1890s and early 1900s. Johnston is the third from the left. This store will feature prominently in a story that I'm going to tell in a little bit. This was an ad of the period of time from Johnston. Notice here that they are buying butter and eggs and receive the highest market price. So that way of doing business of buying from local people and selling those goods in that store was certainly taking place. Here's the lumber yard. This sign right up here is for Lincoln Paints. City Hotel. The Murphys are in the front. Livery stable, looks like it's leaning a little bit. Seen a little bit better days. The barber shop. This photo on the right was taken, I believe, in '65. I'm not sure on the date of this one. Telephone building. I don't have any information on this, but I included it because it does remind us of the advances from horses to this kind of vehicle. And of course, if you have a vehicle like this, it's going to break down and somebody has to work on it. This fella right here seems pretty proud of his machine. I kind of like the way he's leaning there against it like he owns it. Okay, here we see the bank. There's the street. This is the Hall Mooney building. It has faded out considerably, but you can very faintly see the roof line. And there were a couple of windows up there. So it was a two-story building. What I find particularly interesting is right here. This is a community well in the middle of the street. We see a slab of some kind, either concrete or brick. There's a bucket. There's the front half of a vehicle. So somebody is stopping to get water at the community well. There is another picture in existence that shows the other half of it, but the quality of the photo was not good enough for me to show you, but it definitely does show there was a tree, there was a well, it was in the middle of the street. All right, the bank. Bank was organized in 1905 and initially located in the Mooney Hall building, but in 1909 the bank building was built with pressed brick from the Empire Brick Plant, the only building built with a pressed brick. And I've not found any information that contradicts that, so I really believe that to be the case. January 23, 1909, the bank was robbed, and we'll get to that. The bank itself was short-lived. Our records, the banking records that I've been able to find, indicate that it closed somewhere between 1920 and 1922, as did many, many banks in Wilson County, the state, the nation. We know what happened with the economy in the 1920s. So it was during that period of time. The New Albany Bank is listed on the state banking records in 1920, but by the 1922, those were biannual reports. By 1922, it is no longer listed. So somewhere in that period of time. All right, New Albany has a colorful history, and particularly from about 100 years ago. And so now I'm going to go into a little bit of the crimes that happened in this area. 1878, Jacob and William Bledsoe were accused in the murder of several Indians. They in turn were murdered by William Brown. The Bledsoe brothers were said to have been buried in a wagon box in or near Jackson Cemetery. So this, while this one shows what a wagon box from that period of time might have looked like. So that would have been their similar coffin. So this doesn't surprise me, given what was happening in all over southeast Kansas and at that period of time with the Osage Indians being here already and having been here, and white people moving in, some illegally on land and some having ownership. That does not mean that all of the interactions between the Osage Indians and the whites were in conflict, because I don't believe that was the case. I think many times there was a lot of cooperation, a lot of purchasing back and forth items, sharing items, helping each other, that goes on just between people that know each other. But whatever the conflict was here, people ended up dead. Now we have, starting in 1904, a series of deaths that appear to be all connected. 1904, Warren Stallings. His body parts were found on the train tracks, but was he murdered? 1906, his cousin, Fred Stewart, was found murdered in a pasture. He was last seen going into Wiley Johnson's store. Was he murdered? And his body moved. And then 4 years later, 1910, Wiley Johnston's store was in receivership. He left, ended up dead. So the best thing I can do is to tell this story fully is to read the account that Leila Tyndall wrote in The People of the South Winds book. It really is a fascinating story to me. And well written. She, of course, based it on newspaper accounts at the time. New Albany's history contains many stories of cattle wrestlings, shootout on a Saturday night, arson, counterfeiting, attempted train wreckings, but the two, quote, mysterious deaths and the one untried murder appear to have been the result of the other crimes. Warren Stallings, a red-haired cattle dealer, died mysteriously on the night of September 4, 1904. Stallings had been born in Monroe County, Ohio in 1862 and came with his widowed mother and brothers and sisters in 1866. Warren suffered from the disease called alcoholism. Mrs. Hiram Hall, who was the former Clara McCrae, would always remember how the train had whistled that Saturday night. Warren Stallings' body, both arms and one leg severed from it, the head badly crushed, was found on the railroad track near Will Pegleg Wilson's residence, south of the Schoolhouse Railroad crossing by Mr. and Mrs. Ira Garriott. The Garriotts had met him an hour earlier at that same crossing as he made his way home down the tracks to the east. Engineer Hutton of the extra eastbound freight didn't learn of the casualty until he reached the Neodesha Roundhouse and found a man's hat and a part of a bottle on the pilot. Thinking a man had been struck near Neodesha, he wired Fredonia to notify the following train to run slow and watch for the body. Later, he would recall seeing a man dressed in a white shirt and dark trousers running from the railroad track in New Albany. Warren's knife was found a short distance from the Schoolhouse Railroad crossing. Shreds of clothing were strewn along the track, attesting to the body having been dragged a considerable distance after being struck. The body was lying with the head facing west, the direction from which the train came. Those who disliked Stallings and had good reasons to kill him suggested the alcoholic had become indifferent to his danger from the trains. The majority of the New Albionites believed he had been murdered, as he knew too much about the nefarious activities in the area. County Coroner Wiley deemed an inquest unnecessary. The poor man in his drunkenness had been run down by the train, had he not? Dr. Frank Tracy, an investigator from Kansas City, Kansas, obviously did not agree with Wiley. He haunted New Albany in the weeks after the death. Clues were turned up. However, fear of reprisals kept the witnesses from testifying in a court of law, and Warren Stallings' untimely death would remain a controversial matter to this day. Warren's cousin, Fred Stewart, who was living in California at the time, returned to New Albany, vowing to find Warren's killers. Fred, who was George and Jenny Stewart's son, was also an Ohioan, coming to Wilson County in the early days. He had served with a standing army in the Philippines. In 1905, he purchased in partnership with Philip Crane the Lewis Guess Carpenter Shop and opened up the New Albany Meat Market, the highest prices for hides and furs being paid. March 9, 1906, and this was how many years? About 18 months after Warren was found dead. Fred went to the New Albany State Bank and withdrew $130 from the meat market's account, intending to buy cattle at a farm sale that day. Leaving the bank, he crossed the street to Wiley Johnston's store, entered, and was never seen again. His mother, Jenny, searched for Fred and found he had never been to the sale. He had never returned to the meat market. March 28, and this is about 10 days later, William Gibson was in the Batterton pasture 5 miles northwest of New Albany when he came upon the deteriorating body of a man. The identification was made when a New Albany checkbook was found in a pocket. Fred Stewart, a large, strong man, aged 32, had a bullet hole in his head above the ear, and his clothing was slit on each breast and on the back. The knife had only slightly scratched the skin. A .38 caliber revolver was near his feet, 2 chambers empty. His hat brim was scorched by the shot. Also 2 fingers on one hand, with the back of one hand slightly cut, indicating he had wrestled with his assailants. Cartridges were found in his pocket. His shirt collar was open, the top buttons missing, as were the top buttons of his vest. Mud was on his knees and shoe heels. The $130 was missing from the body. Fred's mother hired 2 Pinkerton detectives to find her son's killers. Although evidence was turned up, there were no arrests, and Jenny Stewart Blinn would go to her grave believing her son's body was in the back of Wiley Johnston's store while she was there purchasing groceries. Well then, in 1910, so this is now 4 years later, Wiley Johnston's store was in receivership. And in March, he left New Albany on the Frisco, headed for Joplin, carrying $2,500, according to his daughters. Saturday, April 2, he was found wandering dazedly around Fredonia with only $5 on him, his head badly beaten. The Johnstons said Wiley had been sandbagged and thrown off the train near Columbus, Kansas, and the Frisco conductor told them that as Wiley boarded the train, another man had followed him. At his home, Wiley Johnston lingered between life and death, and certain citizens volunteered to sit each day and night during the ordeal. He had been treated each day by Dr. McCrae, and surgery had been performed by Dr. Duncan of Fredonia on the day Wiley died. He had been showing his improvement, and his death was a shock. Most of the little community believed his injuries and death were the result of Johnston knowing too much about the deaths of Stallings and Stewart. So 4 years, 6 years after those events had happened, a perhaps witness died. Although there were investigations into the three men's death with resultant evidence, there were never any arrests or trials due to the fact that witnesses feared for their lives, and thus the questions remain to this day. Quite a story. So, where was law enforcement when all this was going on? Well, in August of 1906, a detective named Schwartz was placed in jail with Pegleg Wilson of New Albany for the purpose of solving a series of crimes in the New Albany area. So, he came from Wichita. He was not himself a criminal, but he was placed there to see what he could find out from fellow inmates. At that time, those arrested for various charges were Grant Maxwell, Joe Penwell, and Pete Wilson for crimes including cattle stealing, burglary, robbing Mooney's Mill, and the murder of Fred Stewart. Okay, let's get to the robbery. This photo shows, well, it's commonly known, this story is sometimes known as the stranger in the buffalo coat. Rita Ralph and a woman by the last name of Brockway wrote an article in a series of articles in the Wilson County Citizen in, I believe, the 1960s, and they titled their series of articles "The Stranger in the Buffalo Coat." And so this is what a buffalo coat looks like, but I grabbed that from the internet. Robbery, the details of the robbery are interesting as well, so please bear with me as I read this narrative. The recorded facts pertaining to the robbery of the New Albany State Bank in the early morning hours of Saturday, January 23, 1909, reads like a dime novel. The daring robbery began on the morning of Wednesday, January 20, when a man dressed in a light-colored fur coat got off the Frisco passenger train and limped off toward Rock Street, which led to the main business district. Miss Elsie Hall at the telephone office saw the stranger first as he limped toward the Hogue drugstore. Miss Jenny Hogue, spinster druggist, was happy to answer all the questions the man asked in regard to the town and its businesses. From the Hogue drugstore, the man went to the bank. Bill Grouch was a troubleshooter for an oil firm, and he told Daniel Webster Parker, the bank president, he might be in town for some time, learning about New Albany's oil and gas boom. Thursday, this was the next day, Marvin Hickox found his bloodhounds, Lion and Gypsy, noted guardians of the town, writhing in pain as though they had been poisoned. The next day, Friday, January 22, Bill Grouch returned to the bank and assured Parker his firm was more than interested in the oil and gas prospects of the town, as he was going to recommend considerable investment by his company. They would need assurance of the bank's solvency. How much cash did the bank keep on hand to meet their large payroll? Parker assured Grouch there was adequate cash to cover the firm's needs. Grouch told the banker he was leaving on the evening passenger but would return with his employer before too long. As Grouch passed the telephone office on his way to the depot, Elsie Hall saw him and felt there was something different about the man that night. His fur coat was turned up about his ears and he walked fast as though not to miss the train. And then she recalled what was wrong. He wasn't limping anymore. By bedtime that night, Marvin Hickox had buried one of his bloodhounds and the other was in bad shape. What kind of person would poison good hunting dogs? The Hall girls, Elsie and Flo, slept fitfully in the telephone office, and one time Flo insisted she had heard noises outside. To appease her, Elsie went to the south window and raised the shade. It was very dark and she couldn't be sure she had heard anything out of the ordinary. However, Charlie Newton, who lived south across the street from the general store, couldn't quiet his wife's suspicions so easily. He too found it very dark when he looked outside, unnaturally dark. The gas light that should have been burning on the bank corner was out. Grabbing his automatic shotgun, he hurried out of the house, his wife following, as he went to alert Parker, the banker, who lived west across the street. They stopped when they saw a shadowy figure patrolling a beat under the banker's bedroom window. They heard a muffled pounding inside the bank and saw another man posted in front of it. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, accompanied by a rattling blast, and they watched as the bank's plate glass windows flew through the air, crashing into the street. Elsie and Flo Hall were jarred out of their beds by the blast, along with many New Albionites. Lights began to burn around the town. Realizing the bank had been robbed, Elsie put on her earphones and plugged into the circuit to call Fredonia. The line was dead. Quickly, she tried making local calls in the neighborhood. All lines were dead. Finally, she reached her home, and Hiram, her father, said he was leaving to round up some men. Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Newton watched helplessly as the 4 robbers, 2 with money sacks slung over their backs, walked leisurely away from the bank and headed east toward the railroad tracks. Flo Hall made contact with Jimmy Dodd on a secondary circuit, a line missed by the robbers when they had cut the wires. The telephone office became headquarters for the details to be passed to Fredonia. The 3 nitroglycerin charges had torn the safe apart, driving the door almost through the wall and ceiling and demolishing room features. The section foreman, alerted by the commotion at the tool shed adjacent to the section house, found the Frisco hand car missing. An eastbound freight whistled near the crossing west of town, and men using Elsie Hall's red tea jacket flagged it to a stop. Ironically, had the train, which was running behind time, not been stopped, it would have eventually overtaken the little hand car the robbers were pumping relentlessly down the track eastward to Fredonia. The cash loss was covered by insurance. Well, we have a little bit more information about what happened to those robbers. There were at least 3 men that were implicated. Bill Grouch was the alias, and then Charles Grouch and James Grouch. It appears to me that James Burns, whose alias was Bill Grouch, took the fall for the rest of them. Because James Burns was the one that had been casing the town. George Wilson was released for lack of evidence. Thomas Doyle had an alibi. Clyde King was released for lack of evidence, and then he disappeared. So James Burns pleaded guilty to grand larceny and was sentenced to the penitentiary for not less than 5 years at hard labor. So now let's go to something a little more positive. Who were the doctors in town? Well, those that I'm aware of that were listed: P.W. McKay, A.G. Marshman, and I think Dr. M.E. McCrae is perhaps the most well-known. Came here in 1885, died in 1927. I believe that at the time of his death he was blind, and I believe that he died of prostate cancer. Here's a picture of Dr. McCrae. There were several pharmacies. Of course, the most well-known was the Hoag Drug Store, which was founded by Scottish Highlander R.B. Hoag and later his daughter. Miss Jenny Hoag took that over to the right. This is their residence, Jenny's residence, just to the north of the drugstore. She was quite photogenic and apparently liked to have her picture taken, because we do have numerous pictures of her. Here she appears to be a little bit older. She's wearing spectacles. This is her brother Albert, and he worked part-time to help Jenny. Here we see a flyer for from that period of time from R.B. Hoag. Looks like when the well, it says for sale, but I think that just means the items that are for sale. And dandelion alternative, dandelion roots. So medicines of that time were a little different than what we might choose today, but some of them may have worked better than what we have today. Of course, let's talk about the period of time. We know what happened in Prohibition. So this is a note that was probably typical. This certifies that I want 1 pint whiskey for medicinal purposes, that I will not sell or give it away, nor use as a beverage. And same is actually necessary for medical purposes for my family. Signed R.B. Hogue. And noted New Albany. Yeah, we can make some assumptions about that. Education. It should be noted that kids have been educated, young people have been educated in many ways forever. Parents teach their children, and then they're more organized in homes, and then when it becomes possible, there were many country schools, and this photograph, the date is unidentified, it's an unidentified photo, and I don't know the location. It could very well have been from one of the local country schools, because there were numerous country schools in the area. We're going to focus a little more directly on New Albany schools. We know that there was a grade school and later the 2-year secondary school. The school district itself was organized in 1866, and exactly 100 years later, the school district became the last to enter USD 484 at the time of consolidation. All right, this building is identified as the first New Albany school built in March 1883. I'm not entirely positive about that, though. We know the first building stood at the end of West Main, where the former Baptist church was located. And this one, I believe, when you look at those plat maps, it's just curious to me. Here we see, okay, there was the Baptist church, and that would indicate that a school was here. Here we see the school. And the note is that in 1883, a 2-story brick school building was completed, situated on East Main, right here. So I'm just not sure about the location of this structure. We can certainly say it was one of the earliest, if not the earliest. We see here some other notations. Here's the church, that one's not noted. There was a church there. This says post office, lumber yard, store, depot up there. The high school. And then we see a second story was built in 1922 to serve the high school, large stage, auditorium, and basement. We have numerous pictures at the museum of classes. This one is unidentified. It does look to be a little bit older student, if this is indeed a school group. I'm not actually positive of that. Interesting story about this building. 1923, by September, the district was in dire financial straits. A bond election failed, and the bank refused to handle warrants issued for $14,000. W.S. Berryman, lumberman at Fredonia, filed suit for over $6,000 due and won the suit. Well, in 1946, this building was gutted by fire, and it was replaced with the one that stands today. Here we see some of the classes. This one's kind of curious. I don't know what's up with all these scars. They look oversized, so I don't know if they had a craft class as part of school, and a race to make the biggest one, I don't know. Had a volleyball team. What's notable to me here is look how they all have hands on each other's shoulders. That tells me it was a close-knit group of teammates and friends. Whoops.
So Leanne, the first building that was gutted by fire, was it in the same place that the school is now?
I believe so.
Yes,
Yes,
Yes.
I believe so.
all three of them.
Okay.
Well, the
Okay.
whole story to that, if you guys really want to know the truth, I think was Frosty Bivens was on the school board, and they said he was mad at the school board that they thought that he might have been the one to burn it down.
I've read that anecdote. I wasn't, I don't know.
That's the story I always heard from them.
Okay, this picture is from 1926-27. Notice the little urchins without shoes on. How did they get to school? Well, on a school bus, of course.
Yeah.
This is 1928 Model A Ford. Lena Price, Nellie Young, Charles McGinnis, Jimmy Swindler, Thelma Murphy, Velma Shelton, Marie Fraser, Nellie Morgan, Mildred Beck, Bytha Laughlin, and Charlie Shelton was the driver. We know that faith communities are one of the first things that become established in a community, whether it's with a formal church or not. New Albany at one time had 4 churches. The Baptists were the first to become established in 1866. Methodist Episcopalian had 30 members when they started in 1870. Christian Church in 1878, and then the Presbyterian Church in 1868. Here's the Baptist Church when it was in use by the 4-H. Presbyterian Church in this photo looks very much like a house, but structure of the time.
Leanne, this big bell out here, if I ain't mistaken, come out of that Baptist church.
Yes, it did.
Out of,
Yes.
right in there.
Well, you took it out of there.
I know.
Okay, cemeteries, 2 main ones in the area, Weekly Cemetery, east of town, and Jackson Cemetery. First person buried in Jackson Cemetery was thought to be Drury Lee Blacksmith in 1864. Buildings don't make a community, though. It's the people and what the people do together. This community did have an active Mason group and an Oddfellows organization. There's a note in the from the newspaper in 1879, that's very early, baseball fever raging at Jackson's Mill. Taller Ridge versus the Lick Skillet clubs. Anniversaries have been scheduled here. In 1965, celebrated New Albany's 100th birthday. In 1996, the Pony Express run from Cloyville to New Albany was reenacted. The Busy Beavers 4-H Club has been around a long, long time. This old photo is of Civil War Veterans Reunion. The Odd Fellows Parade. The Masonic Lodge number 18 was organized here in 1869 with 11 members initially, and it disbanded in 1973 when their members transferred to Fredonia. Here are photos from the Centennial Celebration in 1965. And then the country's bicentennial celebration in 1976. And we see that the Saddle Club, Fredonia Saddle Club, participated. There was a square dance, ham, beans, and cornbread supper. Lots of stuff going on. Burr Badgley's band was rather prominent in the community at one time. You see names here that are very embedded in the history of this community. Badgley, Laughlin, Petty, Maxwell. New Albany has, of course, been hit with tragedy of one kind or another, and nature has not always been kind to it. Friday, October 9, 1914, the tornado destroyed the Methodist Church, many houses and structures, and killed 2 people. Have a little bit of information, a little bit of narrative. I want to pick out a couple of items from. We know that weird things happen with tornadoes, things that just cannot be explained. And so I want to share just a little bit of this. This is from Gladys White, who was the daughter of Dr. McCrae. She recalls the terrible destructive force of the storm, which struck about 6 p.m., and how in trying to get into the well, she says cave, but I'm sure it was some kind of storm shelter, her father struggled against the wind to open the door. Her father had had an intercom system installed between the home and his doctor's office. The batteries had been dead for a while, however. However, such was the electrical force with the storm that after it left, the batteries were charged and the intercom could not be shut off, its sound carrying for blocks. Only by having a telephone repairman disconnect the wires was the intercom silenced. And then another account, this was from an area where there was a barn. A barn in which 2 horses were hitched was carried completely away, leaving the horses complacently feeding at the manger uninjured.
Leanne, I think that's the tornado that also left a little girl dead by the church, behind the church when the tornado
Yes.
went through.
Yes.
And my mother said that her and her father laid in the ditch. And then when they got home, all they had was a cow standing at a post where the barn was at.
Mm-hmm.
But the cow wasn't hurt any.
Of course, most people in the room remember very vividly 2009 when the tornado, May 8, tornado killed 1 and destroyed the Post Office, Methodist Church, and damaged other structures. So we've seen that New Albany has a rich history. I have shared what I feel like is bits and pieces of it, and there's much more to be told and shared. But I kind of wanted to end this by thinking about what really is the story of many, many small towns, and what causes a community to change from a place where there is a lot of business, a lot of thriving activity going on, and many houses, to what it is later on. Well, the railroad leaving. Railroad leaving changes commerce, and it changes the way people move around. When the schools close, gone are the activities that went along with it, the social activities and the tight-knitness. You know, those students went in with Fredonia kids and kids from Coyville and other areas. So that changed things. When natural gas was no longer as available as it was at one time, that changed industry. And then these 2 things are tied together really. When the highway no longer came, main highway no longer came through New Albany, had an impact. But when there was also the availability of traveling to Fredonia and other towns, that meant, you know, people had bought the cars, they could now travel to Fredonia or some other community to shop, for social life, for church, for whatever, which meant they weren't here. Of course, what happens in many areas when you lose the structure to a tornado, you're not going to rebuild the exact same structure. In most cases, you either won't rebuild or you'll build something a little bit different. It's a time when people have disasters when they move to a different community. So I think all of that happened. This one I'm sure had a major, major impact. So while tornadoes, natural disasters, and things beyond control and the changing of society had a big impact, it's not true to say that New Albany now, the sun has set on New Albany and it is no longer vibrant. That is simply not true. We know that despite the clothing of businesses and churches and schools, the community identity stays strong. Chicken noodle dinners is just one evidence of that and the popularity of that. The fact that this church has been rebuilt tells me that the faith community here is very strong. And areas where the faith community is strong, that makes for a thriving community. Community members, from what I understand, they come together and they help each other when help is needed in big ways and little ways. This one, I think, stands big in my mind. Compared to other towns that would qualify as ghost towns, they lost their post office. New Albany is filled with many well-maintained properties. We can all think of several in the area where, man, there are a lot of lots that look just terrible. But that's not happened in that same way to New Albany. The attendance in the room today and those watching online tell me that there are a lot of people that really have a lot of respect for the local history, that want to know about it. It still feels like current events to them, and they have a respect for that history. And that's a great, great thing that brings people together. I want to thank you for your attendance here, for sharing stories and remembrances. Glenn and Brenda Ecton will have the bank over after this that you can visit there. We do have signs marked around town showing where some of the locations are. I think most of you had picked up or been given a map that shows where those places are. For those of you that are watching online, I'll see if you can see that a little bit. It looks like that, with a listing of about 36 spots. Those of you that watching online that may want a copy may stop by the museum sometime, and we hope to have some of this information at least posted on the museum website for you to refer back to. That may take a couple of weeks, but be patient with us as we try to share as much information as we can. So thank you for your attendance, and I'm going to shut off the live in just a little bit, and then we'll have more conversation. Thank you to the Methodist Church for hosting this event. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Did a good job.